Hello, everyone. We are just waiting for people to join, and we'll be starting in just a minute or two. Well, I think we'll get started. We are waiting for one of our commentators to join us momentarily. And I think he will be here by the time I'm done with these introductory comments. Welcome to day 2 of our symposium, 1 year on human mobility and human rights in the COVID-19 pandemic. And over 3 days, we're taking stock of the rights of people on the move in light of the so-called 14 principles of protection for migrants, refugees, and other displaced persons. This is a document that was drafted by a group of international law experts a year ago, and it's been now signed by more than 1,000 academics worldwide. I'm Alex Alenikoff. I'm director of the Zolberg Institute on Migration and Mobility at the New School. And this event is co-organized with Monette Zard, professor and director of the program on forced migration and health at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University. And Iain, who is a clinical professor at Cornell Law School, and he co-directs the Asylum and Convention Against Torture Appellate Clinic. Yesterday, we looked at the freedom of movement in the public health response to COVID-19 with a terrific paper by Chiloka Bayani. And today we have 2 presentations. The first, starting in just a minute, is on digital health technologies in public health surveillance. That will run till about 9:45, and then immediately after that panel, we'll start a second panel called The Right to Health, Access, and Equity in the COVID-19 Response. For each session, we have a paper writer and a respondent. Each will speak for about 10 minutes, which will leave us plenty of time for questions from the audience. So please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A section, which I will monitor, and I'll feed questions to the panelists for the first session. And we will, by the way, end promptly at 10:30 today. For our first paper, our first panel, we'll start with a presentation by Petra Molnar, excuse me, who is acting director of the International Human Rights Program at the University of Toronto School of Law. And her remarks will be followed by comments from Alexandra Klosovsky, who is a senior migration health advisor at the International Organization on Migration, IOM. Their complete bios are in the program materials, so I won't spend time now going through them. You can consult them there. And so we'll start right away. Petra, over to you. We look forward to your comments. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you to Monette and everyone for organizing this wonderful symposium. It's really my pleasure to share with you a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing recently that lies at the intersection of migration, health, and surveillance. I have a brief presentation that I will share with you. Hopefully it works. It's mostly just photos from my field work that I've been doing here in Greece. I'm joining you from Athens today, where it's really beautiful and sunny. But what I really want to do today is just tease out some of the intersections when it comes to how COVID has been used and weaponized to introduce surveillance technologies in some pretty unprecedented ways, and where we might be going with this. Because one of the issues when it comes to new technologies is that we are dealing with a highly unregulated ecosystem of experimentation that unfortunately adversely impacts people on the move. This work is a collaboration from a number of actors. I'm now at the Refugee Law Lab at York University, but this all started with a report on Canada's use of algorithms and automated decision-making in our immigration system. For those of you who are interested in tech and migration, please do check it out. My most recent work, though, really lies at the intersection of law and ethnography, trying to bring in the lived experiences of people on the move as they interact with technologies of migration control, particularly in the time of COVID. Now, when we talk about technologies of migration control, we really are talking about a broader panopticon of techno solutions that have been introduced at and around the border. So things like algorithmic detention decisions at the US-Mexico border, automated decision-making in visa applications, a variety of biometrics, and big data and population predictions. And now, of course, with COVID, we are again seeing this rise and this turn towards biosurveillance when it comes to trying to manage how the pandemic is playing out in different contexts. In my work, I try to foreground the lived experiences of people who are actually at the sharp edges of this technological development, because we are just now starting to have conversations about the human rights impact of surveillance technology, let alone in a moment of global crisis like a pandemic. But one set of perspectives that is continually not engaged with enough are the perspectives of the people who are actually crossing borders and who are on the move. I spent last year interviewing over 40 asylum seekers, refugees, and people on the move about their experiences with technology and how they feel about the way that everything is playing out. And apologies. And unfortunately, the way that their experiences are playing out maps onto the way that power and hierarchy operates in migration management, generally speaking. And this quote, I think, is really indicative. It's from Adisu, a young man from Ethiopia who is currently living without status in Belgium. And when we talked about technology and surveillance, he really highlighted how systemic racism is inculcated in the decision-making that drives the ways that technology is rolled out. And according to Adisu, we are Black and border guards hate us. Their computers hate us too. There's this understanding that because racism and discrimination is already inherent in the way that a lot of border decision-making occurs, technology will and already is exacerbating that. There's also feelings of dispossession and feelings of being reduced to a data point, feeling like a piece of meat without a life, just fingerprints and eye scans, just like Caleb told me when we were speaking in Brussels last summer. These are individual people's lives who were impacted both by their migration journey and also by COVID. So this was a community that was essentially in lockdown in the middle of a squat in the center of Brussels. They were reduced to data points. They were introduced, into a variety of biometric databases, and yet a lot of them had questions about the humanity and the dignity of the process. My other work is a little bit more systemic, and I've been in Greece over the last number of months trying to document how surveillance technologies are playing out in the border spaces of Europe. And for those of you who, of course, follow migration-related issues, might remember that last September, the Moria camp on the island of Lesbos burnt down. My colleague, Kenya Jade Pinto, whose photography you're seeing, and I traveled there and tried to understand how these low-tech situations of crises also become testing grounds for surveillance technology. And again, how COVID is weaponized as a way to close people in, to justify the creation of more closed camps and detention centers, and also to bring in many other technologies of surveillance. For example, here you are seeing the COVID area of the new camp that was hastily built. It's essentially barbed wire that is made to isolate people who are COVID positive. And again, we're dealing with humanitarian crises with thousands of people rendered homeless, and in the middle of a pandemic too. Why are these places the ones that continually become used for technological experimentation? For example, the Greek government has been introducing all sorts of different ways that, for example, unpiloted drone technology is being used in the Aegean, the way that automated decision-making will be used in a variety of criminal proceedings. And again, 5 new camps are being built on the frontier islands between Greece and Turkey. And all of these camps will have a surveillance panopticon baked into the way that people will be interacting with these essentially closed detention centers. I'm actually off to Lesbos again next week to do a follow-up study. So hopefully we will be able to publish something on this in the coming weeks. But again, these frontier spaces are ones that are so interesting and so troubling to understand, because once again, the kind of decision-making and discourse formation that happens in Brussels, for example, filters down very differently to places like Greece and Italy, the ones that are quote unquote Europe's shield, where also regulation of new technology doesn't exist and COVID is being used as a way to ram through innovation without thinking about the human rights impacts. And really, we're talking about a dire situation where people don't even have access to food and water. So why are we investing in things like, automated drones, automated decision-making, surveillance technology, without actually thinking about the ramifications of these innovations? But there are really 6 main takeaways that I want to leave you with. This isn't just some sort of forward-looking exercise. These technologies are already in use and in development. And again, the sheer scale and potential impact is quite extraordinary. I mean, we're talking about thousands, if not millions, of lives that are affected, globally speaking, when it comes to migration management tech. And the risks to human rights and lives are real. This isn't some sort of, theoretical exercise. I think, again, the context here matters, and particularly given the subject matter of the symposium. We're talking about immigration decision-making that is already highly discretionary, with really weak safeguards and oversights. And that context is so key when we're trying to see how these technologies are playing out on people's lives. I won't get into this point too much, but again, I think it's also important to remember that we are dealing with an increasingly hostile environment when it comes to migration and border crossing. And this kind of nexus with national security law and decision-making is very, very clearly felt, both here in the European Union, but also in other places like, the US-Mexico border, and even in Canada, this conflation between national security and migration. But perhaps most importantly, we are all seemingly engaged in this kind of AI arms race, as other scholars have called it. But this turn to techno-solutionism is really often not appropriate to try and understand and fix major humanitarian crises. Because there are real human rights impacts. And I mean, we could do an entire symposium just on this. And a lot of my work tries to unpack the way that human rights are playing out. But I'll just mention 2. I mean, there's the obvious issues around privacy rights and data protection, and the contextual specificity when it comes to recognizing that any data breach when it comes to the information of an asylum seeker might have really profound ramifications on their lives if it's shared with a repressive government, for example. But perhaps more worryingly also are the issues around equality and discrimination, and the fact that we know that technology is not neutral, that it replicates biases that we all hold ourselves. And for me, one of the most disturbing examples most recently is the iBorder Control project that was piloted in the European Union and purported to basically roll out so-called AI lie detectors at the border that would determine whether someone is telling the truth or not. Now, I'm a refugee lawyer by training. I'm not a technologist. But from that perspective, to me, this is incredibly worrying, because how can an AI lie detector deal with differences in cross-cultural communication? Or even issues like the impacts of trauma on memory, or even in the COVID moment, what if we make really problematic determinations about a person's plausibility or truthfulness when it comes to, the fact whether they took a COVID test or not? These solutions, again, just highlight and replicate the biases that we have in society, and they are by no means neutral. And of course, this is an intersecting set of issues that we really need to look at from a holistic perspective. The last thing I will mention, and I won't get into this too much, are some of the administrative legal issues as well, which are important to think about when we're turning towards biosurveillance, automation, and new technologies to manage migration. Because we are playing around with what we consider a reasonable decision maker. And how do we actually challenge a decision in a court of law when a mistake has been made? What if you are wrongfully deported as a result of a technological decision? Who is responsible for that? Should it be the immigration officer that is using a particular technological tool? Should it be the person who is checking or vetting that decision, or the person who is designing the tool? Should it be the algorithm itself? Should algorithms have legal personality in court? I mean, these sound like far-fetched questions, but I think this is where we are as a society. We really need to ask ourselves how we're going to regulate and think about procedural fairness and standard of review when it comes to these new tools. But why is this all happening? And I will end it here, perhaps on a more philosophical note. Technology replicates power, particularly in times of crises like a global pandemic. And historically, it's about making migrants trackable, intelligible, and controllable. And I argue in my work that this lack of governance that we are seeing is deliberate, because it allows for testing of new technological solutions without having to think about the human rights impacts. Now, I think the conversation is turning and we are starting to think more about these issues. But it's also about broader questions around participation and democracy, and about who gets to imagine what world is possible, particularly after such a global event like a pandemic of the sheer scale that we've been seeing with COVID-19. So I will leave it there. I will perhaps put a link to our report in the chat for those of you who are interested, and I really look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Petra. Really interesting set of comments and concerns here. I'll go straight now to Alexander Klosovsky from IOM. Alex, I hope you can start your camera and join us in the comments. Great, nice to see you, welcome.
Thank you very much, and thanks a lot, Petra, for this introduction. It was great to hear. It was great to read, but even better to hear. And thank you everybody for the opportunity to participate in this important event and to review the paper written by Dr. Molnar on the use of digital technologies to monitor and advance migrant health and well-being in the context of COVID-19 pandemic. I personally found this paper very interesting to read and relevant to our work. As you know, International Organization for Migration has been closely involved in responding to this public health emergency from the perspective of assistance to vulnerable groups of migrants and trying to restart global mobility affecting a lot of migrant populations. I think everybody knows about the issues with the resettlement, about other things that we've been trying to address and been trying to find a way to safely operate our projects to provide assistance, balancing the needs that we're going to discuss today. So as you know, for us, most of the assistance is happening during the cross-border activities, and this is well within the scope of our discussion and affected by all the challenges mentioned by Dr. Molnar. In performing these activities, we are trying to work closely with the member states, World Health Organization, other UN Migration Network member agencies and partners to ensure integration of migration health concerns in the global response, in the national plans, in the international response to address the issues that we face. And again, these issues are related to some of the challenges highlighted by Dr. Molnar. Health is a fundamental human right, but as we know, refugees and asylum seekers, stateless persons and the internally displaced are often excluded from health systems due to the lack of inclusive policies, language barriers, documentation issues, no ID, other factors. So safeguarding their health is known to protect the host communities, the sending and receiving countries, but at the same time, it's not always recognized, and we have people falling constantly through the cracks, marginalized, exposed, and unprotected. So the pandemic response to the health crisis encouraged or somehow aggravated a lot of issues, and while encouraging further digitization, commercialization of the response and the use of advanced technological solutions for sensitive immigration tasks, it's, as again mentioned in the article, is done sometimes not in a way that it's friendly to vulnerable communities or without the degree of review or accountability that we would like to see there. So it's therefore crucial that the health proofing measures that are developed by countries rely on inclusive policies to avoid discrimination, while also integrating comprehensive data protection standards to protect migrants' rights and dignity. So we, again, here face a difficult balance because not facilitating the use of certain solutions that are mandated at the moment and that can potentially help to restore human mobility will completely exclude vulnerable groups from traveling, while applying certain solutions, of course, create challenges that we are trying to address. So we, again, looking at how we can try to navigate this complex environment with the help of the partners to ensure that we try to avoid global mobility divide, digital divide, that we address the barriers that may potentially increase regular migration by pushing migrants of lower socioeconomic status and poor digital literacy to seek out the help of brokers, intermediaries to migrate, and exposing them to more risks and higher costs. So digital health records, as we know, can easily become a major data privacy issue, and safeguards are especially needed regarding the involvement of third parties, data sharing. And I believe that all these issues were well described in the paper of Dr. Molnar, and these concerns, again, we of similar nature, we see in our daily work when ensuring inclusion of migrants and refugees to the national response plans and cross-border mobility protocols. And we do see that the discrimination, the gaps disproportionately affect migrants and other marginalized communities, exacerbated by the use of new technologies. But at the same time, I think it's important that we work together on the common goal to restart the human mobility and to ensure that the migrant-friendly technologies are there to help properly cover these groups. Otherwise, they will also be excluded from these important, especially for people who migrate, these important activity. To address these issues, we work with international agencies and member states at multiple levels. We are part of the WHO Smart Vaccination Certificate Consortium, UN Travel and Trade Workstream, IATA, ICAO discussions, other working groups. The ethical workstream of the WHO SVC Consortium is in particular relevant to our discussion because similar topics are being discussed there. On the best ways, how to limit the non-intended use of the new technology, how to make sure that the technology is, has as little limitations and issues that we discussed as possible, and how to look at non-intended use of the new technology by different actors, including the private sector, as also highlighted by the paper of Dr. Molnar. And I believe that's an important work, and I hope that we can look at these issues together. In conclusion, I would like to thank Dr. Molnar for her work on this and previous papers that I also read and found very relevant to IAM activities and to protection of vulnerable communities. I find this effort and the larger work on the 14 principles of protection for migrants, refugees, and other displaced persons in the context of COVID very important for achieving our common goals, and hope to continue this conversation, hope to participate in updating the principles in order to reflect the constantly evolving changes, developments, challenges that we've been facing for the past year. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and looking forward to more discussions.
Thank you, Alexander. Let me again invite people to put questions in the Q&A section, but I'll start with one. Petra, I'm hearing Alexander say something slightly different than you in the following way, although I don't think you'll disagree. Is that you said that technology is not neutral, and then you had sort of your slides showing the ways in which this could be really serious infringement on the rights of human rights of people on the move. But as he points out, technology is also used by people on the rights, so people who are moving. So while it's used to surveil irregular migrants. Migrants use it to surveil police people so that the messages go back as to where the obstacles are and the checkpoints are and the like, and it's actually used by people who want to move. So how does one talk about a set of principles, or you said we're entering now into a discussion of the right way to regulate this, that negotiates both the good parts and the troubling parts of the use of technology?
Thanks, Alex, for that excellent question, and to Alexander for your commentary. I mean, you're right, it is very complicated in the sense that, of course, just like any complex issue when it comes to migration and technology, it of course isn't all negative. And yes, my work is situated on a particular spectrum where I'm trying to understand, how things are playing out on people's lives. But you're absolutely right. I mean, people are using technology in really empowering ways as well. And I think we would be remiss not to think about that. But I think one way to move forward is, again, questioning at which point and where do the perspectives of people with lived experience of migration come into the discussion? Are they an afterthought where, it's almost this kind of tokenization of like, oh my God, we forgot to talk about the community, let's include them at the end, which I have unfortunately seen many times over in a variety of projects? Or do we include people's perspectives right at the get-go and ask, how are you using technology? What is beneficial about it? What are you worried about? What are the experiences that you are having? And unfortunately, I think this is once again a failure on our entire sector, that we are having conversations among ourselves without actually talking to the community in a holistic and deep and meaningful way. And I think that's where that tension can maybe, we can move away from that a little bit to actually hear about how do people want to use technology and what do they feel about it? Perhaps that's a way forward.
Okay. Let me go to, so we have a couple of questions here that we can start with. So for both panelists here, a question saying, given that there are so many different initiatives working on various types of digital health records for COVID vaccination with not much coordination, how can human rights concerns be built into the design and implementation process? And what are the human rights implications of such a fractured tech development field? Petra, do you want to start? And then Alexander can come in after.
Sure. I mean, I think this question highlights, again, a systemic issue with regulating tech generally, because like you mentioned, there is a lack of overarching coordination when it comes to what is being done, how it's playing out, and what are the oversight and accountability mechanisms. I mean, I think the conversation is moving in promising ways, in the fact that we are now not just talking about sometimes wishy-washy things like ethics, but actually talking about hardline human rights and law and governance. But we're nowhere near where we need to be. And again, I think the conversation has to start with the assumption that there will be human rights concerns, and that should be the starting point. And once we are there, then we can start thinking about how all these different manifestations of technology are actually playing out. But you're absolutely right. I think this is the tricky bit, because not only is migration inherently a transnational issue, but so is technology. It's developed in one jurisdiction, used in a second one, repurposed in a third one. How do we effectively regulate this? This is something that keeps me up at night. Maybe I'm showing my nerdy side, but do we look at it from a national perspective, a regional perspective, an international perspective, or all of the above? I think this is very much an open question. And for those of you who are interested in governance type issues, take a look at the European Union's recent proposal on regulation of artificial intelligence as a way to try and think through some of these issues, but it's definitely not it's not a perfect document, and I think we have a long way to go to think about how to make sure that human rights are respected and protected.
I'll just comment. Of course, there's some people who would argue that this this fractured, decentralized process is actually better for human rights, because if you coordinate, it's going to be coordinated on the side that you're least happy with here.
Yeah, and that's another issue too. I mean, whose priorities matter when it comes to coordinating a governance response? Is it marginalized communities, or is it the private sector that has a lot to gain when it comes to the border industrial complex and migration management? I mean, those are also issues. And this is, I think, where discussions around power and privilege are really important to be had, particularly from an intersectional perspective, because as we're seeing, particular perspectives are the ones that are driving the agenda very clearly.
Alexander, did you want to comment on the question?
Yes, I think, again, yes, absolutely. The situation is very complex in respect to digital health records for COVID vaccination, and we know why. We know that there are certain groups working on developing the standards, including governance, ethical, and other issues. The overall international guidelines from WHO is that digital health records, digital vaccine passports, or overall immunity passports should not be used for the purpose of, should not be mandatory for the purpose of the international travel. At the same time, we know that a lot of countries feel that it's important for them to already add immunization to the risk mitigation strategies that they put in place. And we see a lot of developments. We see ICAO developing the visual seals. We see EU digital health certificates. We see a lot of other pilots and going on. Some of them include not only vaccination, but also immunity testing and history of the disease, while again, we have some issues with scientific justification of certain elements included in that. So I believe that it's expected and that we need to expedite our work on the global guidance in order to fill the vacuum, because without that, the vacuum will be filled by various fragmented sources, and some of them, many of them will be problematic, will have a lot of issues, and I think it's inevitable in the absence of global international guidance that have to be created sooner rather than later. Over.
So I understand that why IOM would be opposed to a uniform standard. You can't travel unless you've been vaccinated, given all sorts of issues with people getting vaccinations. Would IOM also oppose a program that gave a fast track to people who have been vaccinated?
I think we see these interventions as a risk mitigation strategy, because we do know that vaccination reduces the risk of transmission, the same as negative test. And we understand that for safe cross-border movements, it is important to show a certain degree of risk reduction and create protocols, travel and post-arrival protocols that are tuned to this risk reduction. So which means that as long as let's say the vaccinated person would undergo some different post-arrival requirements based on the less risk of transmission that is scientifically proven, that's part of the combined risk mitigation strategy that is not discriminatory in nature, but rather looking at different measures applied for different combinations of that. At the same time, if someone does not have access to the vaccine, there should be a way for these persons to travel. So it should not be discriminatory. It should just be, again, part of the strategy that allow the travel, but may have certain pieces in place depending on the status. So I think, I hope that it answers your question. And again, I think it's a complex situation in which we are now with so many different approaches in place. And some of them are justified, but can be used in combination because we don't have any gold standard at the moment. And even vaccination is obviously not a gold standard, as we know that the transmission may still be going on, and with the variants, a lot of scientific developments. So it's not an easy solution, but it's part of the broader strategy when combining solutions in a way that reduces the negative impact and increases the positive impact, restarting the mobility. I think that's where we need to try to find some balance. Over.
Petra, I saw you nodding while Alexander was speaking. Did you want to come in on this, or should I move to another question?
Maybe let's move on. I mean, other than just to say that, yeah, it's a very, very complex issue. And as I think the longer the pandemic goes on, the more complexities are going to be kind of put on the table when it comes to figuring out how to reintroduce mobility in a way that doesn't exacerbate differential impacts of some of the solutions that are proposed.
All right, well, then that's caused me then to ask you another question. So what would the international process look like that could deal with these complexities? You've both really identified in a wonderful way really how difficult a lot of these issues are. A lot of people are talking about it, lots of different, but what would you propose to get the world together? Under the UN, under some other organization, an academic institution? How do we actually begin to resolve some of these complicated questions? Petra, to you first.
That's a really tough question. The mark of a good question is one that makes you think, for sure. I mean, I don't think there is one set solution and one set way forward. I mean, in our work, I think it's becoming really clear that contextual specificity is key when we're looking at how these things are manifesting on different communities, on different lives, and also in different regulatory ways. And again, kind of a one-size-fits-all approach maybe isn't appropriate. But also at the same time, there has to be a global conversation because so many of these issues are playing out across so many different lines of influence, power, privilege. I mean, I think the more interdisciplinary work and the more work that centers the community, that will really, I think, move us forward in finding ways to not only document what is actually happening on the ground, but also to think through solutions and ways forward. And I think that also has to include a historical analysis and an intersectional analysis, because once again, we are in a moment of crisis, of course. And also with technology, it can sometimes seem as this like new set of issues that we need to think about. But really, at least in my understanding, it's a lens through which to look at migration management historically, and the fact that certain communities are ones that are experimented upon when it comes to policy, law, and now technology. It also maps along different racial and ethnic lines. And again, I think it cannot be an ahistorical conversation as well. So, for me, one way forward, again, is to think about who is part of the conversation. How does the international community engage with diverse perspectives? And where are we really going, particularly after, hopefully, this crisis moment of a global pandemic is over? Because once we are past, hopefully, the COVID-19 situation, our world, of course, will be completely different in many ways. And what's next? I think we have to also be a little bit forward-looking when it comes to the manifestations of these issues that we're currently facing in this crisis moment today.
Great. So Alexander's just posted, it just went to the panelists. Maybe Jen can put it for all the participants, a recent WHO document on developing a smart vaccination certificate release. And also I want to call on Iain Kissel, one of the co-organizers here, who can unmute himself and follow up either with a response to the question I asked or a further question to the question. I wasn't quite sure.
Yeah, thanks, Alex, and thanks, Petra, for your response to Alex's question. I suppose I might ask a follow-up question to Alexander on the back of this. I was just thinking of Iain Diachiumi's recent thematic report on the intersection of racism, xenophobia, and related intolerance and tech and immigration. And it recommends specifically that IOM, among a number of other particular recommendations, should adopt mandatory policies and practices for analysis of potential harmful or discriminatory impacts of digital border tech in their programs, and then also adopt human rights assessment and oversight mechanisms, including a mechanism for migrants to hold IOM accountable. I've written separately that some of this might be done through a UN network working group in connection with the IMRF, given the focus on data in the GCM. But I wonder, Alexander, if you might talk about the ways that IOM could itself operationally address some of the issues that have come out, and if the recommendations by the special rapporteur are useful in that regard.
Yeah, I believe it's very useful, and I know that we have started adding special modules on the review of a number of projects, looking at exactly these recommendations and looking at how we can some sort of, it reminds me a bit the medical ethical board, when we look at what elements, digital technologies, other things that may affect migrant populations in a way that we need to investigate and how we address that. I know that we collaborated with a number of experts, including, I believe, Princeton University, and I'm aware about certain things happening at different project levels, because, you know, IAM in general is very project oriented. So we have a lot of different projects going on, and we're trying to plug this activity into many projects as they seem fit to that. And then obviously at the global level, we look through this lens when we work in different working groups. WHO, SVC, working with ICAO, IATA on restarting the international travels, and different other work stream of UN work stream on travel and trade. Yeah, I believe it's very useful, and the more documents like that we can have, the better probably it's going to be in respect to the international guidelines being developed. And I would encourage everybody to also look at this RC1 document that was released by WHO for public comments recently. This period is over, but the RC, the second release candidate, will be out very shortly, I believe, in a couple of weeks. So there will be public comments, and hopefully it will be possible to incorporate your suggestions there, because we do hope that various documents produced by the SVC will assist member states and other agencies when creating certain solutions, in making sure again that we meet the requirements and the asks, including what you mentioned from the UN rapporteur.
So we're at the end of our time, but I'm going to take 2 more minutes because we started 5 minutes late. Now, there's one question here that if both of you could get really just a 1-minute answer, but it's always an important question in all these kinds of presentations. And that's, in what ways might civil society organizations, including higher education institutions, contribute to the emergence and development of discursive strategies for facilitating accountability of algorithm governance of migration? What can civil society organizations do in this space? Let me start with you, Petra. Short answer if possible.
Yeah, of course, and great question. Yeah, I mean, not to always repeat what I keep saying, but I think civil society in particular and academia is also really well positioned to question the ways that established entities and actors in the political economy that has grown up around borders and the border surveillance industrial complex. We can really challenge that, I think, together. And again, the private sector incursion into this space has been really marked. And I think we need to really call that out and ask whose priorities matter, and why are certain voices and certain experiences constantly relegated to the sidelines. I think this is where civil society in particular, but also academia, can play an active role.
Great. Alexander, last comment from you on this?
Yeah, fully in agreement. I think active participation, active engagement is important, and we'll try from our end to also make sure that we recommend including expanding different working groups on migration to the civil society organizations.
Great. Thank you so much, both, Petra, for a terrific paper, Alexander, for your comments. You've started us off well this morning, and I will turn immediately to Monette Zard for our second session. Thanks, panelists.
Thank you so much, Alex. Thanks to our speakers. What a great discussion that was. So moving swiftly along, our promise to you yesterday was that we would be short and punchy in these panels. For those of you who are joining us today, I'm Monette Zard. I'm the director of the program on forced migration and health at Columbia University's Mailman School. And I'm delighted to be the moderator of our next panel, which focuses on the right to health, access, and equity in the COVID-19 response. So of course, it goes without saying that the right to health lies at the very center of this pandemic. The last 2 panels really have shone a spotlight on restrictions imposed by states on other human rights, such as freedom of movement and privacy, in the name of safeguarding and protecting public health. But the right to health itself shouldn't be forgotten, and indeed it is key to ensuring an effective public health response to COVID-19. International human rights law guarantees everyone the right to a highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, and requires that medical care be provided to those who need it. Beyond health services themselves, issues such as adequate housing, safe drinking water, food, and protection from violence, the so-called social determinants of health, are also recognized as being central to realizing the right to health, and they're protected under international law as interlinked and interconnected rights. If nothing else, we know that this pandemic has highlighted existing inequities, and that is certainly the case for migrants, particularly undocumented migrants who have long faced discrimination in terms of accessing healthcare. At a time when health resources are scarce, we know that many countries choose to prioritize the needs of their own citizens. That isn't the case across the board, and we have seen some really useful, good case studies from places like Portugal and Ireland and elsewhere. But in the context of this pandemic, migrant communities in many places have had limited access to testing and care. And even where these have been made available, we see that they have lacked access to other critical subsistence rights. Now, I could go on, but we have two wonderful speakers today who I think will help unpack the various dimensions of the right to health in the context of this pandemic. Our first speaker and paper writer is Dr. Joanne Csete. She is an associate professor in the Byrne Department of Population and Family Health at the Mailman School. She was the founding director of the Health and Human Rights Division at Human Rights Watch and executive director of the HIV Legal Network in Toronto. Her research has focused on health services for criminalized populations and rights-based reform of policies on illicit drugs. And then our commentator is Iain Byrne, an international human rights lawyer specializing in economic and social rights. Since 2011, Iain has worked at the International Secretariat of Amnesty International as a law and policy advisor and researcher on economic and social justice. And he's also managed a number of teams, including on economic and social justice, as well as refugee and migrant rights. He's a special advisor on strategic litigation and has been involved in litigation before both domestic fora as well as international and regional fora. And he is a fellow of the Human Rights Center at the University of Essex. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Joanne to present her paper, and then we'll have Iain comment. Joanne, over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share screen. I hope it's being seen. Can you see the screen?
Perfect.
Okay. Thank you to the organizers for including me in this 14 principles adventure. And thank you also to Iain for being part of this. We really appreciate it. The right to health is not the right to be healthy, but the right to a progressively realized package of health services and information, including, most pertinently for this discussion, measures to combat epidemic diseases. In international law, this right was first articulated in the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and has been elaborated on in many subsequent widely ratified treaties, including CEDAW, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Disability Rights Convention, and the Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers. It's embodied in national law in more than 100 countries, most usually in the form of a provision ensuring the right to medical services when ill, as Professor Zard just said, but often with broader rights articulated to prevention and health services. The IOM reminds us of the obvious that migrants, refugees, and displaced persons are likely to have severe health problems because of the conditions they have fled, because of conditions associated with the journeys they've been on, and because of the conditions they live in the present. As already has been said, they may be excluded formally from health services in various ways. Even if included, they may face language and cultural barriers in access to information and services, and they may fear using the services available to them for fear of arrest or deportation. Obviously, people who are in camps or camp-like settings have particular vulnerabilities to infectious diseases that, again, I think are obvious. Just to cite a few examples of the real-life concerns faced by these populations in realizing a right to health, just to kind of get us thinking about these situations. We're reminded often by the High Commissioner for Human Rights that refugees have, sorry, the High Commissioner for Refugees, that refugees have the right to vaccination. Since vaccines are so much on the mind, we might remind ourselves that 85% of refugees are actually hosted in lower income countries, low and middle income countries, where vaccine rollouts, as we all know, have been slow in the face of what might euphemistically be called the reserving of vaccines by high income countries. It's also obvious that if we're talking about two-stage vaccines, they are a difficult thing logistically for people who are on the move. We've already talked in some ways in this symposium about the use of an infectious disease emergency like COVID as a pretext for denial of the right to cross a border, denial of the right to seek asylum, of which there are many egregious cases, of which perhaps the most egregious is at the US southern border, where not only was COVID used as a pretext to undermine asylum rights, but the public health authority, the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, whose integrity we badly need in the middle of this emergency, was essentially co-opted to put its name on that order. The consequences, health and psychological consequences of failing to preserve family unity in situations of border crossing is also obvious. Access to information is maybe something, health information, that's not thought about enough. The example that we all know about of cutting off internet access to the Rohingya in Bangladesh is a good one. In that case, not only were people denied access to information about how to protect themselves from COVID-19, but the people serving them with health services were denied the ability to communicate with each other through internet-based platforms. I won't say anything more about the firewall between information gathered for contact tracing and the immigration authorities, since that has already been touched upon, but it's something that we need to think about in public health, as contact tracing is a first measure used in infectious disease emergencies all the time, without perhaps thinking about immigration issues. And finally, immigration detention, which of course is to be avoided for people who don't have a criminal conviction of any kind, and yet has been used in prison-like circumstances. Again, the US is an egregious case, but not the only one, where we see that these situations are essentially creating incubators of COVID-19. So how do we do better? We can look to international law and international guidance and interpretation of international law. The Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights has interpreted the right to health for us and reminds us that, which I should reminder that shouldn't be necessary, but is that the rights inherent in the right to health are not limited to people who are not asylum seekers, illegal immigrants, and so on. So that it's a useful articulation of that notion. The World Health Assembly, the governing body of the WHO, wanted to put a punctuation on this, and so came up with not long ago the Promoting the Health of Refugees and Migrants document and action plan that really puts flesh on guidance to states about how to deal with the very pronounced health needs of these populations, saying nationality should not be the basis for determining access to health, though of course legal immigration status or illegal immigration status often is a basis. In reality, WHO gives some guidance about how refugee and migrant health in a rights-based way should be integrated in health programs and policies. And I think highlights importantly that legal and social protection are complements to health services for these populations. The right to information that's culturally sensitive, linguistically appropriate, user-friendly is highlighted as well as the elimination of unnecessary closure of borders, recognizing that people's ability to claim their health rights may well be contingent on their ability to cross borders. And this was discussed at length in yesterday's session. The Migrant Workers Convention, for that small subset of migrants who are classified as migrant workers, does protect the health rights of migrant workers, at least for receiving medical services when ill on an equal basis with nationals. Though it's interesting to note that this convention is not ratified essentially by any of the countries that we would think of as receiving countries for migrant workers. It's widely ratified by the sending countries. And then, though the Mandela rules, the standard rules for the treatment of prisoners of the UN, are meant not for immigrants, but in the view of immigration detention, we might look to the Mandela rules and their important rules about health and infectious disease, especially as guidance for if there are conditions of detention, and again, and many of them should not exist, how we organize them so as to minimize health risks. I guess just to conclude, I would say that in an infectious disease emergencies, just stepping back a little, this, what I would call subdiscipline of public health science called global health security, gets a lot of energy. And so it has been the case with COVID-19. We have global health security commentators constantly telling us that, again, we're not safe until everyone is safe. There is meant to be this global solidarity around these ideas. And the elements of global health security are depicted here in these 6 icons in this slide. But as the idea of global health security actually plays out in reality, you really have to ask yourself, whose security is it anyway? Because when we look at the policies of high-income countries in these situations, it really looks more like we're safe when we're safe. Arguably, the best thing that can be done for people who are forced to be on the move is to think about how to strengthen health systems in the countries that they are fleeing, in low-income countries especially. And global health security seems to have, in reality, meant a real diversion of billions of dollars worth of resources away from the strengthening of health systems in low-income countries and toward other protection of the interests of high-income countries. There's been a lot written as well about whether this so-called securitization of health, this idea of global health security and the way that it plays out in real life, how it gives a lot of space for the protection of intellectual property of the pharmaceutical industry, the empowerment of the pharmaceutical industry, as we have certainly seen with COVID-19. So can we think about a notion of global health security that doesn't also mean the pharmaceuticalization of policies in the way that we've seen with COVID-19? Those are larger questions, obviously, that are not only relevant to refugees, migrants, and displaced people, but I think are especially pertinent as we continue to grapple with the current emergency. I'll end it there.
Great, thank you so much, Joanne. Really a lot to think about there. And before moving swiftly along to Iain, just to encourage our audience, please do be putting your questions in the Q&A box. We'll try and get to as many of them after Iain's intervention. So Iain, over to you.
Thanks very much, Monette, and we really appreciate, on behalf of Amnesty International, being allowed to continue participating in this great initiative. Apologies if my camera's not great. I should make out to say from the beginning that Amnesty doesn't use Zoom as a platform, and therefore if I try and use my laptop, it blocks certain functionality, so I'm having to do this on my phone and multitask, which we know that men are not particularly good at, but we'll do our best. I thought Joanne, and the paper and both of what she did now gave an excellent summary of the legal framework, and of course, the principle there that's in the principle 2 is very clear that it's based on international law, and international law is very clear, isn't it, about non-discrimination on any grounds, including immigration status, including nationality. The UN Committee on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights has made it clear both in a 2017 statement and also in general comment number 20 around non-discrimination. Again, that refugees and migrants shouldn't be discriminated again on any grounds, including the fact that they lack regularization. And yet we know, we've already heard about through today and yesterday, the reality, and I want to obviously talk a little bit about the reality from Amnesty's perspective and some of the issues we've been looking at during the last year. And I think what we know, and it is a trend that other people have spoken about, that clearly a pandemic merely exacerbates existing inequalities, doesn't it? It merely shines a light on things that were already happening, and nowhere is that less true than in terms of refugees and migrants. But as also we've been saying at Amnesty over the past year, and it's maybe a terrible thing to say, but this pandemic presents opportunities as well as threats to human rights. It presents us with opportunities, and you very quickly seized on that opportunity a year ago to highlight and magnify some of these inequalities. But sadly, I think what we've seen is a very sort of toxic combination of states taking deliberate actions that exacerbate the risk to health of refugees and migrants, of people on the move, and at the same time, they're not responding in terms of the right to health. And yet it's very clear, and just referring to, and just building really on what Joanne's been saying, in general comment 20 again, as SESCA, which is this overarching non-discrimination comment, where it says a lack of available resources cannot be considered as an objective or reasonable justification for any difference in treatment, quotes, unless every effort has been made to use all the resources at the state's party's disposition in an effort to address and eliminate discrimination as a matter of priority. Because what often we face as socioeconomic rights advocates, as lawyers, is, well, the elephant in the room is resources. But then that begs the question, how are those resources being allocated? And I want to come on to a couple of sort of neglected areas, if I may, during the time I've got, that we've also been looking at Amnesty. And as I said, I'm not really going to go over the legal framework and the barriers, which I think, again, Joanne has set out very well. The number of barriers that we've seen, exactly that during the COVID, in terms of people being able to, first of all, get into a country. And then once they're in there, the barriers to access a whole range of economic and social goods and services, whether that's housing, education, and health. And yet at the same time, we know that refugees, asylum seekers, undocumented migrants tend to live, whether in urban areas, and let's not forget that the majority actually live in urban areas, in cities, and not in camps. But in both of those, they are living in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. You can't do social distancing, often don't have access to water and sanitation. A Greek refugee camp, on average, will have a density 20 times that of New York City. And so you've got this kind of, as I said, this kind of sort of toxic combination going on, whereby there are threats to health, there are the determinants that Monette has talked about, and the failure then of states to respond, and often refugees and migrants at the bottom of the queue. Joanne has set out very well some of the barriers, both bureaucratic and institutional barriers, but also the fact of, not putting up these so-called firewalls, as you said, between immigration and health services, putting healthcare providers often in a very invidious position, that they should be reporting and actively kind of being complicit, if you like, in violating somebody's rights, as opposed to putting up those kind of barriers. And again, we see, I've seen it in my work in education, which I do quite a bit, with kids not accessing the education system because they don't have the right documentation. But also, if they do, that could also lead a trail back to maybe the irregular status often of their parents. And in terms of vaccines, and again, I know we spoke about vaccines yesterday, we're going to have a session on vaccines tomorrow, so I don't want to talk too much about that, but just to amplify a couple of things again that Joanne and others have been saying, and we've kind of pivoted at Amnesty. We started off doing a lot of work around health workers a year ago, and then we've moved on to the issue around vaccines. We're part of this global alliance, the People's Vaccine Alliance. We've been obviously pushing for the TRIPS waiver, although I think we all realize that even if that comes, it's not a quick fix. Clearly, people need vaccines now. What is encouraging in a way is there's about 140, 150 countries' vaccine plans do include refugees and migrants. What is not so encouraging is that often it doesn't spell out in those plans how they are going to concretely access the vaccines. And I think that's, again, what I see a lot of in my work. We've got the international, domestic, regional legal frameworks, great, very clear, often, strong normative framework, the principles building on that. And then you've got the lack of operationalization by states, often at the local level, and that's a key issue I think we face, the lack of capacity as much as lack of political will, the lack of ability to deliver some of these goods and services, particularly to the most marginalized populations. So what we're seeing often is that in some countries, refugees were deliberately excluded, such as Colombia to begin with. In other countries, such as Jordan, they were included from early on. In other countries like Bangladesh, they were included, but there was no plan. And in Greece, they've tended to be at the bottom of the queue, and it's still not very clear how they're going to access vaccines. One issue that I just want to touch on, which again, we've been starting to look into, and like a lot of institutions, we've neglected it as an aspect of health over the years, is mental health. And we talk about the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, but often the mental health is a bit like cultural rights, it kind of gets dropped off. And yet we know, obviously, that refugees and migrants, for a whole host of reasons, have incredibly high levels of mental health challenges. Obviously, I don't need to go through them all, you know, traumatized through conflict, through their experience of fleeing, through their inability to secure work, through the stigmatization that goes on with being a refugee and migrant. So, you know, at the same time, again, mental health is overall neglected. As has been said, you know, the majority, 85%, as Joanne said, of refugees and migrants live in low to middle income countries where mental health itself, very little money is spent. I got the figures somewhere. It's just, if I just pull it up here, if I can find it, so bear with me. It's about, yeah, between 2 cents and $1 per year per person is spent per capita. And overall, only 1% of the world's budget for international health aid is devoted to mental health, 1%. So you've got, again, this existential issue, a lack of priority on mental health, and then refugees and migrants as a particular group that are needing that. And then what should be done? Well, the UN Special Rapporteur on Health, who's done a lot of work on mental health and so has really promoted it as an issue, says clearly countries need to have a national mental health strategy, including migrants and refugees. Beyond that, you then need coordination mechanisms addressing the health and well-being of people on the move, and then a roadmap that moves away from coercive treatment and towards equal access to mental health services. Now, obviously, we could spend a whole symposium just talking about mental health, but I just wanted to really introduce that into the debate, because I think often, as I said, we've neglected it at Amnesty. I mean, I was just finishing reviewing a fantastic report that we're going to get out soon on Sierra Leone, and there you've had the impact of conflict, the civil war, Ebola, and now COVID impacting that population. And yet again, Sierra Leone is typical of a very poor country that is not spending enough on mental health and is at the same time not getting longer term sustainable aid for the international community. So what do states need to do? Well, clearly, as Joanne says, you know, there needs to be better integration to access services. There needs to be participation. We heard about that in the previous one, the participation of rights holders themselves in developing plans, overcoming issues like language barriers, other institutional barriers. There needs to also be issues around data collection and monitoring. And I think, again, we see this as a very common feature of why states are falling down generally on economic and social and cultural rights, the failure to collect and monitor disaggregated data across a whole range of groups, whether that's gender, ethnicity, age, geographic location, etc. So these kind of concrete things. And again, in my experience as a researcher working with Amnesty and other places, it's often not a lack of political will, although that can certainly be a factor, but it's often just the lack of technical capacity and know-how. And obviously that's where the international community needs to come in, whether it's the Office of the High Commissioner, whether it's IOM, colleague that we've got on this call, and obviously bilateral and multilateral donors. So I'll sort of leave it there and happy to take any questions. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much to both of you. I mean, you've raised so many critical issues, challenges, and opportunities. And perhaps I'll start us off with a couple of questions, but again, encourage our audience to really put your questions into the Q&A for both Joanne and Iain. But, you know, you flagged in both of these presentations, the fact that a crisis, often presents us with an opportunity. And one of the things that I think has been interesting is to see sort of a very pragmatic realization that the health of one really does depend, the health of all really does depend on the health of one, that every individual marginalized community needs to be integrated into our public health response in order for everyone to be safe. And I wonder if I could ask both of you, how do we seize on this opportunity? Because we have seen some positive examples in places like Portugal, South Korea, to make access to testing, access to treatment. And this conversation around vaccines, I think, is emerging strongly as, being again, an example of why thinking in a more integrated way across populations is important for achieving the right to health. So my question to you both is, what do we need to do as lawyers, as civil society, to build on the opportunity presented by this pandemic to ensure that there is universal health coverage coming out of it? Perhaps, Joanne, I'll start with you.
Yeah, first of all, let me thank Iain. I have to say, when I was putting this paper together, not being a lawyer, I was thinking, I was a little bit conflicted about how lawyerly it needed to be, given the experience of our interactions when putting the 14 principles together. And I think Iain brought out so many more of the realities that should have been better highlighted in what I put together. So I really thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, I live in a city where every single advertisement, every single piece of information that we hear about COVID services says, no matter what your immigration status is, come forward, it's free, we won't ask, we won't talk to the immigration authorities. So, and I know that we are a funny little jurisdiction within this terribly conflicted United States of America, but I do think that we have opportunities to think again about what health for all really means. I think we need one of the things that concerns me, and Iain brought it up, is this discussion that's around the TRIPS waivers in this particular case when it comes to both vaccines, and this is going to become even more relevant as medicines treatments come online. I'm worried that this narrative that we didn't so much hear when all of this started, when all of our TRIPS advocacy started around HIV, we didn't so much have this narrative of, oh, the TRIPS waiver is not enough. There's so much more complexity to vaccine manufacture, et cetera. And that worries me a lot. So I think that, again, this is an opportunity to think about what the securitization of health really means, what the limits should be on states as they approach emergency measures around infectious disease. It's certainly an opportunity to think again about the international health regulations, which I think are somewhat outdated. I think it's an opportunity to think about the power of the private sector and the way that some states are essentially ceding to the private sector the whole matter of things like vaccine passports and obligation of employees to be vaccinated or not. So yes, I think that lots of the big questions that are raised do provide an opportunity. Whether it will be taken or not is another question. It concerns me that the Biden administration, while making signals that it will favor the TRIPS waiver, for instance, and is donating vaccines, that turns out to be a fairly anemic kind of thing until we really see challenges to the pharmaceutical companies that have already received billions in US taxpayer dollars. Again, I don't mean to make this discussion too US centric, but there's so much more that can be done in global leadership to really ensure inclusion, and also to be sure that we're not forgetting the strengthening of health systems in low-income countries.
All right, thanks, Joanne. Iain.
Yeah, I mean, I when you work in human rights, you like to think, you're working on, with this kind of, the notion of the moral imperative. It's, a fundamentally good thing to do. But I think one of the things we're always thinking about at Amnesty is the instrumentalist approach, because I think if you work in human rights anywhere, when human rights always seems to be in crisis. But I think, when you look at some of the narratives that have come, particularly attacks on regional systems, etc., you often feel in a very defensive mode, and you have to then adopt this kind of instrumentalism approach and say, well, what's in it for me? And I always thought working on economic and social rights is the kind of rights that should appeal to everybody, because they're the kind of rights that we all need, regardless. Often the traditional rights that Amnesty worked on for 30 years, the civil liberties, the political rights, of course they're fundamental, of course they're important, and of course we do all that global work, and sadly they are under attack. But to get the buy-in And we've debated a lot of this at Amnesty about, when we decentralize the global south and it's economic, and I see that economic and social rights as much more understanding, there's often much more appreciation. But again, we look and say, well, this is another moment, yet another moment where we should be able to change the narrative. But as Joanne said, that it's quite tricky. And I think, appealing, I think certainly with the health thing, to say, well, that very simple slogan, as you said, none of us are safe until we're all safe, and therefore we've all got a stake in this. But it doesn't take very long before the normal tropes of stigma, discrimination come out, the fear of the other, xenophobia, closing borders, as we heard yesterday, sometimes very clearly for public health measures, but sometimes using it in a very sort of arbitrary way. So I think, we have to definitely take the opportunities to think about what is going to appeal to people, to get buy-in, to recognize that not having large numbers of people in irregular status is actually not good for the greater well-being of society. But I don't underestimate the challenge of that. And the worry is also, people's memories seem to be very short in this age that we live in particularly, and that therefore we will quickly forget. And it will become business as normal, much as we've seen with some of the other things. We think, well, we're going to have a fundamental change to the way we work. Is that going to be the case? Why was there no discussion about the Spanish flu so-called pandemic that killed 50 million people? Why are there no memorials to that? Why did everybody just want to forget about it 100 years ago when it killed more people than the First World or Second World War combined? So we have to, I think we do have to see certain opportunities, but to also realize it's going to be quite difficult, I think.
Right. Yes. No, I think that's certainly true. And when you've worked for the decades that we have in this field, you can see the opportunities, but as a set of civil society actors, as you say, you're stretched trying to kind of cover many bases, including being reactive and responding as rights are violated, but also trying to, finally be in a position where we're able to set the agenda. And it's often very difficult, given that we're a relatively small community, and that it's challenging to say the least.
Can I also say, Monette, that we also have a moment here when donor status, the practice of donors, official development assistance in health is very much at a time of flux. We know that the kind of development assistance in health, and especially for health strengthening, is kind of disappearing. I mean, I do some work with the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria, which put aside a lot of money so that people could deal with COVID without undermining lots of other health services. And that was a good gesture, but at the same time, the US and certain other donors put pressure on countries to put their limited resources into places that will benefit the world or high-income countries more than necessarily that will benefit their own people. And this too is something that needs serious consideration, not just at an emergency moment, but over the longer term.
And that's a very important point. You both alluded in your presentations to the importance of access to science-based, accurate health information as being intrinsic to the right to health. And I wondered if I could ask both of you to, talk about how that is made real in the context of refugee and migrant communities. And not only whether you've come across strategies for doing that, but I'm conscious, we're also operating in a context where misinformation is rife and also often targeted at marginalized groups, including migrants. And so I wondered, what do you think might be some of the, challenges, and again here, the opportunities about building trusted modes of communication with migrant communities to ensure that they are getting accurate, sort of adapted science-based information in their own languages to enable them to really realize the right to health. Perhaps I'll start with Iain, and then Joanne, you can jump in.
I think Joanne will be probably more the expert on this than me. I mean, I think the problem with Amnesty is we're very good at identifying the problems and not so great at identifying the solutions. I probably shouldn't say that because this is being recorded, but I think, I think it's, and we've seen that with some of our research. I've got a colleague at the moment who's in Lebanon looking at the situation around refugees there. And I know that some of these issues, as you said, Monette and Joanne's talked about as well, about, the rumors that, as you said, misinformation. Obviously at the same time, there has been an explosion of access to information and also via technology. Now, the danger is you can have information overload, you can have conspiracy theories. As you said, you have all this misinformation that is being fueled, both amongst settled communities and amongst immigrant communities as well. And you've obviously got to build those levels of trust. I mean, I'm seeing it here in the UK as well. And therefore, the slightly higher levels of vaccine hesitancy that you see around certain minority communities, which then plays into stigma and discrimination. And in fact, we've got tabloid headlines only today in the UK about saying, well, these people, these so-called anti-vaxxers, and there are this sort of anti-vaxxers out there who you'll never persuade, but there are people with genuine concerns, often going back into history as well. And then how do you fuel that? Well, you've obviously, as you say, got to build trust. Who do people listen to? Do they listen to so-called leaders within their communities? Obviously listening to people, hopefully, who are providing medical services. But again, we know that many of these people, particularly if you're in irregular status, are not able to access the local medical services. I would trust my local general practitioner, hopefully, to tell me the truth and to recommend what I do, rather than, as somebody says, checking on, Auntie's Facebook page, for example, to get all my information. So that the problem is, is filtering out all of that kind of noise and be able to cut through. And I suppose, hopefully, people, that sort of peer-to-peer thing that the people can trust. But again, I think there will always be a core group of people who won't take vaccines, whether it's for COVID or other matters, and some will have genuine health concerns. Some may have, as I said, genuine matters of conscience. But you've got to try and meet, I suppose, that slightly larger group that could be persuaded, and particularly with younger people, I think, who are now becoming eligible for the vaccines as well, and seeing again, whether they're going to be persuaded to take the pickup. But I don't really have any other solutions. I'm sure Joanne probably has got some more profound thoughts than me.
I don't know about more profound, Iain. That was great. I would just say that it's only now that we're beginning to get really great analyses of how the information, how trustworthy information played into the way that the Ebola epidemic in West Africa played out in 2014-15. And what we have good evidence now of is that it was so much worse in Liberia because there was fundamental mistrust of the government and everything it was saying, even though the government was putting out fairly good information. So I have to say, looking at that, trust really is the key word here. And looking at that experience in the way that we now have much more evidence than we did even a little while ago, I think we can get good, scientifically sound, even linguistically appropriate information to all people. It really is a matter of finding sources that people feel they can rely on. And I think this goes back to Iain's really important point from the earlier comment about meaningful participation of people in whatever circumstance they find themselves migration-wise in decision-making, or in something like being able to raise their voice about what their information needs are, what kind of information works best. And that we just don't see enough of. Again, it's been a while since I worked in a refugee situation, but I don't think we have much indication that in many situations we really have an effort first and foremost to be sure that those voices are heard in a way that really represents the concerns of the population. And I think that that's pretty fundamental to this whole question of right to information. I would say as well that Article 19 the NGO has done a lot of really nice work on access to COVID information and how dangerous it's been in places like Brazil, even the US, many parts of Africa and other low-income areas, that information has been so distorted and, as you suggested, Monette, often used for malicious purposes to undermine the rights of migrants more generally.
Thank you. So there's one question in the chat that I'm going to pose to both of you. It sort of has two parts, and then I think we will close out the discussion for today. But a question that says, what are your thoughts on the role of human rights in countering stigmatization of migrants? So the role in combating stigma and xenophobia. And then sort of a second part to that, which is, what do you think about disaster capitalism in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic, which I think in part picks up on some of the themes that, Joanne, you've been discussing around, the role of donors and, and thinking about how to ensure that philanthropic dollars and the humanitarian community keeps its eye on the longer term and centers its approaches based on what low-income countries and affected communities, also see as being critical to their health. So it's a two-part question, one on stigma, one on disaster capitalism. Who'd like to go first?
Well, maybe I'll do stigma and leave disaster capitalism to Joanne. I mean, look, obviously, yeah, I mean, human rights enjoyment is the antithesis of stigma, discrimination, xenophobia, hatred. And where states are not robust enough in preventing stigma and discrimination, and sometimes fuel it. And I'm sad to say, we're seeing examples of that currently in the Middle East, I would say, but not just in the Middle East, in many other countries. And of course, where you have the other, where you have somebody that is not of your makeup, then of course it's very easy to play into that. And you see, of course, a whole spectrum. And so, if states as the main duty holder are genuine about guaranteeing rights for all without discrimination, and they sign up to all this stuff, at the end of the day, no one sort of forced their hand. And of course, we know they do it for particular reasons. Look at the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Every country's ratified it, bar still the US. Every country's sign up to that. Education quite obviously plays a part. The aims of education are very clearly set out in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and Article 29, tolerance, diversity, building understanding. And so where you don't have that, and then when you actually have division that is fueled by politicians, then obviously you've got this. So we all have to do better in this. And as I said, I think it comes back to this question about, does a global pandemic, does it prevent opportunities to tell a different narrative? The refugees and migrants who have contributed sometimes with their lives to saving lives through the health workers, that kind of narrative. The guy that invented the vaccine in Germany, that was quite a strong narrative, and Amnesty shamelessly used that as an example of where you can see that actually immigrants have played and continue to play a huge role in every society, contributing in many ways. So I think we have to find positive stories. It's sad we have to do that. We have to counter that, but that's probably also one of the ways that we can kind of try to change the narrative. But it's difficult these days with a lot of populism and nationalism to really push back. Thank God you guys in the US at least maybe have turned a corner slightly on that recently.
We can hope. I know we're out of time. Just let me say briefly on stigma. I think of all the things we've learned from the HIV struggles, stigma has really been the hardest thing to eliminate. I mean, HIV-related stigma is still strong in many parts of the world, in spite of bazillions of dollars of efforts worth of programs. I think one lesson that we do have there is that it's helpful to measure stigma and to measure trends in stigma. The stigma index that was put together by the Global Network of People Living with HIV, that's been used now several times in many countries, has actually helped to shape policy and programs in that area. So I'll just say that. Disaster capitalism, I am a fan of the work of Naomi Klein. I have not given this nearly enough thought, except my sort of Rorschach reaction to it is, we know that this vaccine for Pfizer will be a bigger moneymaker than Viagra, its last big moneymaker. We know that the Gates Foundation, for instance, it's been widely reported that Gates, not to kick a guy when he's down, is making big money off this vaccine, all the while promoting certain ways to roll out vaccine programs that may in fact profit him or his foundation. We can point to many examples of opportunism around this, as with any emergency. Again, I think this goes to how we understand this notion of global health security, whether it has real solidarity in it, or whether it is just a series of opportunities to make money.
Thank you both. I mean, so much to think about in those two, wonderful interventions. And I mean, some real themes, I think, that have run through this morning's discussion around, ensuring that we are centering the voices of those most affected, including migrant and refugee and asylum-seeking populations, but also the role of the private sector, and really thinking more about that in a way that the 14 principles, I think, did not really consciously address. And then, finally thinking about global governance in this area and some real gaps that I think have been identified in terms of thinking about, ensuring that we learn the lessons from this pandemic and wake up on the day after, if we can say that, with a stronger human rights system that works to the benefit of all. So really a huge thanks to you both for your interventions today, and a reminder to our audience that tomorrow is the last day of the symposium. We will convene at 9 a.m. sharp, and we look forward to having you with us for a session on vaccine access and a concluding roundtable that will bring some of these voices together to talk about what we've been hearing. So thank you all for your time, and see you tomorrow. Bye.